Well, good evening, everybody, or whatever time it is in your part of the world. It is my name is Bruce Knotts, and I was the former director of the Unitarian Universalist Office of the United Nations for about 15 years. And it's my honor to introduce a dear friend and mentor, Dr. Jan Dash, who is a climate change activist and author of the Encyclopedia of Climate Change and other books. Dr. Jan Dash was a member of the Unitarian Universalist United Nations Office Governing Board. Jan crafted the UNO's Climate Advocacy Program. In 2008, when I first started, I was focused very much on sexual orientation, gender identity, human rights. Jan Dash patiently convinced me that our UU office at the United Nations needed to also focus on climate change. Jan made it clear that climate change is the outstanding, that climate change, oh, I've lost my place, that climate change is the outstanding survival and ethical issue of our time, with substantial opportunities for a better life for us all. Jan did the math behind the Bloomberg carbon clock. Recently, the UUA issued a statement that it would slow its climate change activism in order to pay more attention to white supremacy culture. We all face issues which grab our attention. We generally advocate the issue closest to our own experience. However, there is one issue that threatens us all. Any delay or prioritizing other issues instead of climate change will bring unnecessary pain and suffering on us all and the entire planet. Climate change is already upon us. We see the damage it is doing to our food security, damage to homes and businesses. In some cases, we have floods that destroy. In other cases, we have droughts which deprive people, animals, plants, and agriculture of needed water. Dr. Jan Dash is one of the world's most knowledgeable people to let us know how we can adapt, mitigate, and hopefully reverse climate change. We are very lucky to have Dr. Jan Dash advise us on this most critical issue of our time. Please welcome Dr. Jan Dash to the NAUA Academy.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Bruce. I appreciate that. It's been a pleasure to work with you all these years. And I have a presentation, so I'm gonna bring it up. Can everybody see that? Yes, okay, good. Okay, so, okay. So what I'd like to discuss with you today is climate action, and in particular, Unitarian Universalists and opportunity and risk. So that's the title. So the talk will be, first of all, a personal note, but Bruce already said most of what I was going to say, so I'll probably just skip that. And then a vision for Unitarian Universalism being a powerful national voice for climate action, which I've had for many years and which I continue to have. And in particular, what can the NAUA do for climate action? And then I'll go on and present a review of climate change, of the risk and opportunity. And I like to stress the opportunity because that's often not stressed. And I believe it's critical to enable us to get to a livable world for our descendants. Okay, so so this is my personal notes. I'm just going to skip it because Bruce already introduced me. And so one thing that I want to do is to talk about faith-based organizations, and in particular UUs. And I believe that there's an opportunity, which is a crucial role in moving climate action for a livable world, reducing climate risk, faith-based organizations. And the basic thing that faith-based organizations have is they can use the word should in a moral context. And so I think that's extremely important. And UUs could, and I believe should, have a powerful voice inspiring and promoting climate action nationally. So we're a small, denomination, but I believe that we can have a much more powerful presence than we've had in the past. And
I think that
Catherine Hayhoe, who some of you might have heard of. Could everybody please mute themselves so that we don't get extraneous noise? That would be great. The most important action is to talk about climate change. So just bring it up, make it so that it's on the first page, not on the 16th page. So I like to have a vision and a mission. And for UU Climate Action, the vision is that UUs as a denomination act with urgency on climate and influence policy. That's the vision, it's a state. And how do we get to that state? Well, promote and organize with resources to achieve the vision. So it's that simple. Now, as a footnote, many climate actions are possible and needed and are effective. Some UU climate programs actually do exist now and have in the past. And one of the things that I've always believed would be very helpful, even necessary, is that UU climate action participants should be networked together. So that's the vision and the mission as I see it for UUs. So there is a history of UU climate action. And I'm not actually going to go through it. I've participated in many aspects of it, as Bruce indicated. But just as a 50,000 foot level, there are many individuals, dedicated climate warriors in our denomination. They're great. They do all kinds of things, very involved. At congregational level, there are many climate actions by individual congregations. And there are also UU organizations that have many climate actions. The big challenge for UUs, I believe, is to keep climate action on the front page. There's so many things to worry about. Can we keep climate action on the front page? One thing that I always stress, and I believe it's a very useful framework to adopt, are the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And I believe that that's a way of tying together all of the social issues that we care about which we care, and climate action. So I'll stress that in the talk. Okay, so what can the NAUA do? Well, you're a starting organization, I know, but talk about climate action as a priority. And to the extent that you can, aid, assist, nurture, support climate action. And connect climate to other issues. And I believe the SDGs is the appropriate and the most useful and framework in which you could do this. One of the things that I like to say, and people who talk about the SDGs stress this also, is there is no possibility of a long-term solution to the other issues without solving climate change. Let me say that again. If you want to solve all the issues with which we're concerned on a long-term basis, we have to solve the issue of climate change, because otherwise these other issues have no long-term solution. And then as a corollary, if we don't mitigate climate change enough, that means stopping climate change by various actions, which I'll discuss, it will be impossible, literally impossible, to adapt enough to climate change without causing enormous suffering. And it would just be much easier if we did mitigate climate change. So this is what I believe, as a kind of high level vision, mission, and specifically what the NAUA can do. Okay, so that's the beginning part of the talk. Now I just want to spend some time talking about a review of climate change. And for you, some of this will be review. For others, some parts of it may be new, or perhaps there's some updates. But I think it's important to go through it because making sure that everybody's on the same page. So first of all, there's risk and opportunity. So what is the risk? Well, the risk is very simple. We have the potential for disastrous damage to the human race. So climate change is already taking lives and homes. It's damaging infrastructure and it's costing money. And it can get much worse. And if humanity as a whole does not act more robustly soon, it will get much worse. So that's the risk. What's the opportunity? Well, in transitioning to a renewable economy, which is necessary to solve the climate problem, it's a huge opportunity. First of all, for a healthier world, for an industrial revolution. Since the Industrial Revolution and the digital revolution, I believe this is the next big change that provides opportunity. So in order to get to a renewable energy economy, which, by the way, for example, will provide more jobs, we need tens of trillions of dollars in investment. Tens of trillions of dollars of investment. And if you look at what governments actually are able to do, governments can set policy and should set policy, sensible regulations, which are needed, and provide some money. For example, money as in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is about $500 billion for climate action. But what I have just said is that we need tens of trillions, not $500 billion. So governments just don't have tens of trillions of dollars. Just a fact. So where can we get tens of trillions of dollars needed to transition to a renewable energy economy and leave a livable world for our descendants? It's business. Business is the only entity on the planet that has tens of trillions of dollars. So business has to do the heavy lifting to move to a renewable energy economy because it's the only source of the amount of money that's actually needed for investment. So the bottom line is, regardless of what you think of business, we live in the real world and that's where we are. Government and business have to work together in a productive way, and that's the only solution. So that's the opportunity, actually, also for business, for government, and for everybody in order to stop climate change, which is increasingly causing these heard of problems, and which will get much worse, and move into a renewable energy economy where things will be much better. So we hear about climate justice a lot, and that's there. And for me, climate justice is very simple. It's to reduce the risk and take advantage of the opportunity for moving to a renewable energy economy. So that's the headlines in the review. Now let me get into a few details. So the basic word that you want to associate with climate action is that it's urgent. So the vision, again, is to have and leave a livable and just world. The mission is to basically eliminate, that's in quotes because it's a complicated story, but basically eliminate carbon dioxide, CO2 means carbon dioxide, as I'm sure you know, emissions, and that which is causing the global warming trend of climate change, and thereby mitigating climate change. Now, when I say carbon dioxide, there are also some other gases. Methane is the leading one besides carbon dioxide. They're all called greenhouse gases, and they lead to global warming. So you may be confused about global warming and climate change. Climate change is all the changes in climate. It includes natural variation, but there's a trend in climate change, which is up. Temperatures going up globally, that's global warming. So we have both climate change and global warming. It is the most critical issue, as Bruce said. It is the survival issue of the whole human race that is at stake. Now, it is true that the poor suffer the worst and have the least responsibility. Correcting that is climate justice, to lessen the risk and take advantage of the opportunity. There's another concept which sometimes gets lost, but for me, it's a critical issue, and that's intergenerational equity. That means our grandchildren. So let me go through some of the details. So the weight of carbon dioxide emitted per year per person on the average across the planet today is 1 elephant. Okay, so that gives a scale of the problem. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now is the highest it's been in a long time, 3 million years, for example. The temperature globally is moving out of historical bounds since civilization started. So if you meet somebody that says, well, you know, climate change is not so bad, you say, well, how do you know? Because we are moving into a region where humanity, since the start of civilization, since the start of agriculture 10,000 years ago, has not experienced. So how do you know it's not going to be a problem? I mean, just as a one-liner to somebody who doesn't know anything or who doubts the seriousness of the problem. So climate change is a human survival issue. So we've always had disasters, but as a whole, as a one-liner, disasters are made worse due to global warming. And there are a whole bunch of them. Bruce outlined a few of them. Each one of these bullet points is a 1-hour lecture, and I'm not going to spend any time really on any of them besides mentioning them. So I'm going to mention, I just mention them just so you hear them, and you know many of them, I'm sure. So global warming makes disasters worse. For example, what? Well, more crop failures. That means hunger. Worse fresh water shortages. So water experts say that by the end of the century, between 500 million people to half of humanity will have water shortages. That means water to drink. Sea level rise. Sea level is rising faster than models predicted, and including the possible rise in sea level, which is due to Antarctic glaciers. That's a long story, but sea level rise is going up. That means loss of habitat near the oceans. There are many cities near the ocean, which will become uninhabitable. Another problem with ocean response to climate change is acidification. When carbon dioxide goes into the water turns acidic. That, for example, is killing coral reefs, which are the home for fish. About 1 billion people on the planet rely on fish, so ocean acidification. More intense fires. I'm sure that everybody is aware of the fires in Canada and the particulate matter that has made the skies look like Los Angeles looked to me when I was growing up, which is where I was. So more intense fires, completely out of statistics. Worse extreme heat waves. Droughts in places where there's not enough water, not enough rain. Flooding in other places where there's too much water. And weather, more extreme weather and more extreme hurricanes. More disease. In many ways, the head of the major health organizations have called climate change the worst risk to public health in the 21st century. More severe species extermination, more political instability and loss of civil rights. Well, how can that happen? Well, it can happen because, for example, the next point, more climate migration. So if we have now a situation where, tens of thousands of people are having to move because of climate change in one way or another, making life unbearable for them. In the future, tens of millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people will move. That will promote autocratic governments with the loss of civil rights. We see it actually now in Europe with the rise of right-wing governments, and in the United States as well, reacting against migration from the south across the southern US border. If we think that that's a problem now, wait for 30 years and see how many millions of people with huge multiplying effects are people crossing the border simply because they can't live where they're living now because of climate change. Increased conflicts, that means wars, national insecurity, and terrorism due to fights over water and land and climate migration and all kinds of things, which the US Defense Department is extremely worried about. Here's one that I don't think gets enough publicity, but I'm extremely worried about it, and people that I speak to who are knowledgeable about this are also extremely worried. And that is economic and finance worldwide systemic disruption, possible breakdown. That will affect everybody. That means the economic systems, which are essentially unstable as it is, will become more destabilized with worse climate change. There are irreversible tipping points beyond which we simply can't go backward, and that has to be recognized. And there are also impact feedback. So when one impact is present, another impact will also be present. So this is a short list. Okay, if you want details, ask me questions about any of these. I can elaborate. So it's a human survival issue. I want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. If you haven't seen them, here they are. These are goals to which all countries have agreed. They agreed to achieve the sustainable goals. This agreement was reached in 2015. The United States is one of the signatories. And they cover all the social issues that we are concerned about, which we are concerned. Written mostly for the global South, where mostly inhabited by people of color. So racism is certainly in there. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, and then quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, and all the others that you can see in front of you. So these are all the social issues that we are concerned about. Look at number 13. Number 13 is climate action. So climate action is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is built in with all of the other issues. So I believe that if we think in this framework, it will be extremely useful, because all of the social issues that we're concerned with and climate change are integrated together. I do also want to mention that sometimes people talk about environmental justice. Which is extremely important. That basically means pollution, but that's not really climate justice. So that's the problem. There is good news. The action that we can take can mitigate climate change, and if we do enough of it, it will mitigate climate change. So I've always talked about climate action in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned, but also simple risk management, climate change risk management. And what we have to do is to reduce and eliminate with all deliberate speed and to the extent that we can, carbon dioxide emissions. So how do we do that? Well, we need action at all levels, local to global. So governments at all levels, that means municipalities, cities, states, national level, and at the international level as well. So all governments. We need businesses, as I mentioned, that have to do the heavy lifting. Individuals, of course, because all these organizations are made up of individuals, and individuals acting as individually responsible to try to reduce their footprint is important. But more important than that is the leverage that individuals have within these other organizations and NGOs. So faith-based organizations like UUs, environmental organizations, investors are increasingly active in climate action, and academia. So we need action by everybody. It's also important to recognize that there is no silver bullet. So if you hear somebody say in response to a suggestion of some particular action, well, that's not going to cure that's not going to fix the problem. They're right, because actually no single action to fix climate change or sufficiently mitigate climate change exists. Instead, what we need is a portfolio of 100 climate actions. Okay, so you think of each action solving the problem, a little bit of the problem, but all together solving the problem. So that's what we need. A good reference for that is Drawdown, if you know what that is. If you don't, you can Google it. They have an excellent book and you can read about it. There. Other useful references are the IPCC reports, of course. Okay, so climate action, mitigation. Well, advocacy for leverage, that means policy leverage, influencing businesses, influencing other people to have leverages, more mitigation for transition to a renewable economy. What about adaptation? Yes, we need to have more adaptation. We need to help countries that are being hit by climate change now to adapt to climate change because, you know, it's only fair, right? They didn't really cause the problem and they're getting hit by adaptation. They should be helped, and that's true. And there are funds which are supposed to do that. But we cannot let adaptation be the dominant focus because, again, without more urgent mitigation, adaptation to climate change will eventually simply be impossible. And we don't have much time to guarantee a livable world. Okay, I do want to mention the climate conferences at the international level because it's very important. Sometimes people don't really appreciate how important they are. It's the highest level forum for climate negotiations. The two, and they're held every year in different places. And the two that I regard as singularly important are at Copenhagen, which is 2009, and Paris at 2015. I was actually at both those conferences. So at those conferences, a new paradigm for countries acting on climate change was adopted. And it consisted of what are called nationally determined contribution, or NDCs. So instead of a top-down approach where certain goals are fixed for different countries, which was the Kyoto Protocol, this is different. So voluntary NDCs are made country by country, what they can do and what they're willing to do on a country by country basis. And that's been done. So all countries basically have NDCs. The United States has one. What we need, and it's a good start. It's a good start, and it's really the only really significant international progress that we have. And what we need is what's called enhanced ambition for the NDCs, and that has to happen basically now. So ramping up the guideline, and why should we do that? we do it because the analogy is we're all in a leaky boat, and unless we all bail the water out, we're going to sink. That's the analogy that I like to use. So we shouldn't have any free riding, which is countries that simply, say, let other people do it. Everybody has to participate. And that's complicated, and I'm going to show why in a minute. So climate is everybody's problem. So what are the basic underlying issues? Okay, so now I'm going to show some data. So some people like to look at graphs, and so I'm going to show some graphs, and I think the presentation will be made available so you can look at the graphs. And if you don't like graphs, you just close your eyes and listen to me, because I'll just talk about them. So the annual emissions of carbon dioxide get the most attention. So here's a graph showing the annual emissions with uncertainties, which are the widths of these little bands, as a function of time from 1970 up to 2020. And you can see that up to about 2004 or so, the United States, which is this pink line here, was emitted the most carbon dioxide year by year. Next was the European Union, and then Russia and China. But China has, for a bunch of reasons, been, for the last 20 years or so, the leading annual emitter of climate change. So this is these are the numbers that get all the attention. However, what is important for global warming is the cumulative carbon dioxide, the total amount of carbon dioxide, not the annual emissions for carbon dioxide. Let me say that again. The total amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is what determines global warming, which is the trend upward of temperature globally, which is causing the problems of climate change that we are seeing, and which will get much worse. Why is that? It's because individually, carbon dioxide molecules, while they may go up and down, as a whole, stay in the atmosphere on timescales of 100 years. That means that all of the carbon dioxide, basically, that's been emitted since the Industrial Revolution is still up there. So it's the total amount of carbon dioxide that matters. So if we look at which countries have the most total carbon dioxide, well, it's the United States has the most carbon dioxide. That's illustrated by this graphic with this big green box here. That's the biggest. The European Union is next, China is third, and so forth. And so that's what's happened up to now. And in scenarios going forward that leave a livable world, the United States will still be first. So if there's one fact that you take away from this talk, it's that the cumulative carbon dioxide is what matters, not the annual numbers. So this is a complicated slide. I'm just going to talk my way through it, and you don't have to look at this because it's pretty complicated, but there's an essential concept. It's really important. It's called the carbon budget, the carbon budget. And the carbon budget says how much carbon dioxide, can we have in the atmosphere before the world becomes unlivable. And this graph basically illustrates different scenarios that have these labels here. And on this axis is the total amount of carbon dioxide cumulative that's in the atmosphere for a given temperature. And these are the uncertainties. So the bottom line is that when you look at what is needed in order to make the world livable, there's not a lot of carbon left in the carbon budget. That's the problem. That's a huge problem. And the carbon budget is fixed by physics. It's not fixed by policy or desire or morality or anything. It's determined by the properties of carbon dioxide molecules. This is extremely important. One other thing, you can see that the cumulative carbon dioxide, which is up in the atmosphere up to now follows very closely the rising temperature or global warming, which is this trend upward about which you see fluctuations, the totality of which is climate change. So that proves to anybody who is interested in looking at a graph that cumulative carbon dioxide is in fact causing the global warming. And it's not just a correlation, it is causation, because there are dynamical principles that say that if the carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, then it has to lead to global warming. So the per capita greenhouse gas that's emitted, that means per person, is a climate justice equity issue, energy equity, and it's a negotiation issue. It's behind all of the negotiations which take place at the climate conferences. So the annual per capita carbon dioxide emissions, which is a proxy for the energy, listed by country here, you can see that the United States far and away uses more energy per capita, has in the past and is now still, than other countries. And next is Russia. Here is China. China's been going up. It's still only a fraction of the United States. So these four graphs illustrate the essence of the problems of mitigating climate change. Okay, well, let's talk about what does it mean to have a livable world versus an unlivable world? Well, there's an agreement that was reached at Paris called the Paris Agreement that aimed at well under a +2 degrees centigrade rise with respect to pre-industrial levels is necessary for a livable world. So, and a target of 1.5 degrees. So in these negotiations, degrees centigrade are used. So a rise of 1 degree centigrade is a rise of 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you look at what the situation would be if we didn't get to where the Paris Agreement says that we should get to, then the disasters are much worse at 3 degrees, and at 4 degrees, we have an unlivable planet. I would not want to live on this planet with a 4 degrees rise in temperature. So these are all small numbers, 1.5, 2, 3, 4. How can that matter? You know that from day to night, the change in temperature is much more than that. From summer to winter, it's much more. Well, the difference is that when it's winter, when it's summer in one place on the Earth, it's winter somewhere else. So the rise in temperature where it's summer cancels the fall in temperature when it's winter. So that doesn't matter. And day by day, the same thing. When it's hot somewhere, it's cold somewhere else. So that cancels out too. These are global average increases, and the Earth is so big that even a small change in the average temperature globally has a huge effect. So there are all kinds of fallacies which are associated with this, but it's basically, the resolution is basically what I just said. Okay, so where are we? Well, if the NDCs that have been promised are actually carried out, then this is, so this graph is a little bit dated, but it basically gives the idea. Then currently, the current NDCs show, as a function of time, the emissions per year follow these curves. Developing countries are going up very rapidly. China has gone up and it should plateau. And the United States and European Union are much less. But again, what's important is the cumulative amount. If we are to achieve the goals of the Paris Accord to get to 2 degrees centigrade or less, then the emissions of all countries must markedly decrease by 2050 in order to achieve this. That means everybody. I mean, aside from equity, aside from all these other, just the fact that there's a carbon budget is enough to tell you that all countries have to decrease. That includes China, India, the United States, European Union, Indonesia, Russia, everybody. And if we want to get to 1.5 degrees, it's much more difficult. So huge decreases are basically needed now, or otherwise we have to pull out carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a later date so that there's overshoot, and then we'll get back to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So I do want to mention before I stop a real problem, which is that there are deniers of all the facts that I've been talking about. So dangerous climate science and risk denial of global warming. And before I go through it, the various types, the huge risk is that climate action is obstructed by deniers, and they exist in the United States, mostly in the Republican Party, but you know, in other countries as well. And they exist in four forms. First of all, I've showed you that global warming exists. You saw a graph about it. And deniers, since about 1975, when it became obvious, the signal came out of the noise. Some deniers deny that. Global warming is caused by humans burning fossil fuels. You can prove that with isotopic analysis of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. It comes from burning fossil fuels. Some deniers deny that. Global warming has huge impacts. I've been talking about that. Experts from each one of the fields of the impacts that I mentioned at the beginning say that these impacts are occurring and are getting worse. Deniers will deny that. And global warming can in fact be mitigated, and deniers deny that. So it's in four forms. Some people are in one or the other, but it's a huge problem. This is a cartoon that I recently found that kind of gives a summary. You can take a look at it. This teacher is talking about Pythagorean theorem, and here's a whole bunch of students that are raising objections to the Pythagorean theorem. And it seems funny, but I've run across all of these in terms of climate denial, so you can have a look at that. Okay, so these are the last words. Climate action. There's opportunity to cope with the risk, which is huge. And I like to say, this is how I end all my talks, is to act with what I call COP, attributes for climate action. C is courage. Every one of the things I've brought up needs courage, because technically it's difficult, and it's difficult because of the obstruction and because of inertia and because of all of the things that we want to do besides act on courage. So courage is very important. Optimism. So people ask me all the time, Jan, are you optimistic? And my answer is I don't have a choice. So I have grandchildren. I have a little granddaughter who's 5 years old. So when she gets old enough to ask me, Grandpa, what did you do about climate change? I'm not going to say, well, I got depressed and quit. I'm not going to do that. So we have to have optimism and persistence. So climate action is not something that can be achieved successfully in a week, a month, a year, or 10 years. It's going to be a very long-term effort. I think it's going to be 50 years, for example, where we need to act with persistence, not a sprint. And again, to start off, as I started the talk, can be a powerful climate voice. So my parting words are: look for climate action opportunity, apply climate risk management, speak up, act with these attributes. And if you are already acting, and I'm sure you are, then thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jan. It's a wonderful talk, as usual. We've got several questions to go through. I'm going to talk about the first question. I'll give my own answer and then push it over to you to give your answer. Okay. But there are about 3 questions here talking about carbon capture. And I kind of see this as a way of ducking the issue. And it's like, okay, we're going to have carbon capture so we can continue to put CO2s into the air, fossil fuels because we're going to have this new technology to capture carbon and put it into the soil. I would want a both and approach where we use both things rather than saying, well, we're going to put all of our money into carbon capture and just forget about CO2. But and people talk about a couple of questions here saying that they're talking about, using soil, making soil healthier so that can capture carbon. So that's the first question.
Okay, great question. Very important question. You're right about both. So I like to say climate mitigation is not a question of or, it's a question of and. So we cannot use carbon capture the way some people want to use it as an excuse not to do it and not to act on climate change, because carbon capture right now is not economically viable at a large scale and does not promise to get large, to become viable at a large scale in the near future. It is going to be necessary to adopt carbon sequestration on a large scale at some point. And the reason is very simple. If you look at, you have to know a couple numbers, but right now there are over 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what does that mean? It means if you just count molecules of different elements and molecules in the air, if you just count them, then in 1 million molecule, there are over 400 on the average carbon dioxide. You've probably heard of 350.org, and you might ask yourself, where does 350 come from? Well, it corresponds to 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's going to be necessary to achieve a livable world. And there are various reasons for that, and it's a good estimate. So we need to sequester right now over 50 parts per million from 400 down to 350, just to get to 350 parts per million to get to a livable world. So it is going to be necessary to make carbon sequestration work on a large scale. Right now, it doesn't happen. And if you adopt the idea that carbon sequestration is all we need, then you fall into the no silver bullet trap. So there is no silver bullet. Carbon sequestration is a good example. Now, what kind of carbon sequestration can we have? And there are lots of possibilities. The one that is probably the a leading candidate is, yes, make the soil more, with regenerative agriculture and better practices and so forth, more trees, poplar trees, switchgrass, absorb more carbon. Although you run into problems, for example, the wildfires in Canada, if you think trees are totally the answer, then there's a problem. Or there are other things, there's biochar, other possibilities. Or you can sequester the carbon in caverns. That's possible. It's difficult to keep the carbon dioxide down there. And all the fracking that's going on with natural gas has eliminated many of the caverns that could have been used for carbon sequestration. So it's a great question. The answer is yes, and we need all the other 100 things to mitigate climate as well.
Thank you. Next question is, can you address methane, which is much more potent greenhouse gas, even though it is shorter lived?
So methane, yes. So I concentrated on carbon dioxide for a reason, because that is the biggest long-term effect. Methane is also important. It is contributing a sizable amount right now to global warming, and has the property that there's something called the global warming potential, which says that a molecule of methane is worth, and it depends on what timescales you're talking about, but a good number is 100 times the global warming effect of a carbon dioxide molecule. Methane is released in various ways. One of them is through fracking and through pipelines, natural gas pipelines, which are emitting much more natural gas than we used to think. So that's a problem. It's emitted in agriculture as well. Cows emit methane, sizable amounts of methane. And so, yes, that's a problem. And when you get into the weeds, you'll see that, there are in fact other greenhouse gases which count as well. And so I try to simplify the problem by talking about carbon dioxide. The bottom line is fossil fuel burning has to stop as quickly as possible, with the understanding that some remnant of fossil fuels will have to continue for products that we can't get any other way. And that produces, natural gas is one of the fossil fuels that was originally thought to be a bridge fuel to a renewable energy economy, but has its own problems. And one of them is emitting methane through leaks in pipelines and also in the fracking process itself.
Thank you. I'm here in Pittsburgh to attend the UUA GA, and one of the questions that are coming up here at GA is about divesting. And so this question is, what about the pros and cons of divesting from financial institutions, banks, and investing heavily in oil, that invest heavily in oil and gas industries? Are there any financial institutions that do not invest significantly in oil and gas industries?
So that's another great question. So on a long-term basis, the answer is that the fossil fuel industry is in big trouble. Because if we're going to, so there are two possibilities. Either we move to a renewable energy economy by burning much less fossil fuel, which means that most of the fossil fuel that's left has to stay in the ground. It can't be burned, because otherwise we blow through the carbon budget. So on a long-term basis, the value of fossil fuel stocks are going to go down because of this fact. And so it's a good idea to get out of them on a long-term basis. On a shorter-term basis, prices, that would reflect the long-term problem of climate change and getting out of the fossil fuel sector may not be there. But it's a good idea to start, divesting from fossil fuels. And the UU, I think the UU investment, due to a concerted effort, I can't remember when it was, maybe 7 years ago or so, started by individuals in UU Climate Action, did pass an AIW for divesting from fossil fuels. So in terms of, but there is one question that always comes up, which is, okay, so if you divest from, if you have no shares of Exxon, then you can't influence board policy by passing stockholder resolutions, and that's true. And stockholder resolutions are getting more and more active in terms of promoting better governance and better policies through business. So it's kind of a mixed bag. One approach is, get rid of most of the stock and just keep some so that you can participate in these shareholder actions. But on a long-term basis, the industry, the fossil fuel industry is, that makes fossil fuels is basically dead.
Okay, thank you. Next question, it says here, you mentioned only businesses has trillions of dollars to devote to combating global warming. I'm not sure you actually said that, but anyway, what is it in it for them? What is, when their bottom line is concerned, what's in it for them? Why should they be incentivized to do that?
Because you can't do business on a dead planet. You can't do business on a dead planet. So in order to get to a livable world, we have to mitigate climate change. More and more businesses are understanding that. So it's a slow process, but the numbers of businesses that are now actively making net zero pledges is, that's a whole story in itself, is increasing rapidly. And there are, just as a detail, there's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And scope 3 emissions includes the whole supply chain for a given business. Apple has, for example, declared that it will be carbon neutral by a certain date, even in scope 3. So many businesses are doing that, number one. Number two, there is now a framework called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is hard to say if you don't say it 50 times. So, and what that is a body that has put forward guidelines, excuse me, guidelines for businesses to report, calculate and report their climate risk, and also start acting on it. That's voluntary. I actually know about it because I was the head quant at Bloomberg, and I knew so this was an effort that was actually headed by Mike Bloomberg, and I know the people at the Secretariat at Bloomberg who were implementing this. And actually, I was on a working group for scenario analysis for the TCFD in the early days. So that's one thing. It is also important to know that regulation is coming. So it's coming first in Europe, but it will be in the States at some point, regardless of what people want or don't want in this country in terms of regulation. A simple way to understand the significance of that is if you have an international company doing business in Europe, you will have to abide by European regulations in order to do business there. So that's very important. So that's all the kind of sticks. But what about the carrots? Well, that's the opportunity. So when my hair is gray now, right? But when I was a student, I used to carry boxes of computer cards up to a mainframe computer. And the mainframe computer was a centralized computing system. And if you look at what we have now, here I have one of these things. It's got more power than the mainframe, and everybody on this panel has one of these, right? And so what happened is that by going to a decentralized paradigm for computing, we actually increased economic opportunity. It was a huge boon for basically everybody. I believe that decentralizing the energy economy and moving to a renewable energy economy will have the same effect. And businesses are starting to understand that the future is in this direction. So what's in it for them? Well, basically participating in the new economy, and not being, in last century's economy, but moving forward. So businesses hate to miss the train, and the train is moving. The train is unstoppable. So right now, if you look at new energy, power, it's all wind and solar. There's no fossil. It greatly is outstripping fossil fuel new energy deployment because it's cheaper. It is cheaper to have wind power in the Midwest than to build a new fossil fuel plant, and even to have an existing fossil fuel plant in some cases. It is cheaper to have solar panels and solar power in the Southwest and in some places in the Northeast than a new fossil fuel plant. So it simply makes economic sense. And moving forward, also, we're decarbonizing the transportation sector, moving to electric vehicles. All kinds of, auto manufacturers have said as a certain date, they're going to stop making gasoline-powered cars. ExxonMobil is moving out of the gasoline business. And so, we're moving. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be without friction, but the transition to a renewable energy economy is basically unstoppable. And so for business, the bottom line is that they will take part in that transition. If they don't, they're going to lose. They'll just miss the train. And increasingly, they're understanding that. And investors are putting more and more pressure on them to do that, to understand their risk and take advantage of the opportunities.
Well, the questions are multiplying. I guess we can keep going until we get tired of them, and then we'll just take them one by one. But so your graphs have shown us the United States per capita CO2 emissions have gone down over the last several years. How did we manage that?
So a lot of it was moving away from coal. And, you know, natural gas is better than coal. I mean, coal is the worst. And so a lot of the coal industry in the United States has traditionally supplied the bulk of power. It's going down in terms of its use. Part of that is it's simply uneconomic to run a coal plant relative to a natural gas plant, and natural gas for the same energy pollutes less. Even though methane is a problem with natural gas, it's still better than coal. I want to also point out in terms of coal that there has been an effort which has been extremely successful, which combines action by Sierra Club lawyers and Michael Bloomberg's philanthropy, putting coal mines and power plants out of business because they violate environmental laws. And so it's simply too expensive for the coal facilities to abide, to put into place the framework necessary to be in compliance with environmental regulations. So they got out of business. So this effort has put half of the coal plants out of business in the United States, along with the transition to natural gas. So a large part of it was that. Also, the use of solar and wind. It's still a small fraction, but it's increasing, and that has played a role. Energy efficient appliances are more common now than they used to be. One thing that I would like to stress is, in terms of heating your home or cooling it, heat pumps are becoming more prevalent. Heat pump simply moves energy around. It doesn't actually generate energy, so it works with electricity. So it's a combination of many things that has led to that slight decrease.
I'll do a little editorializing here and cut some of these down a bit. But the one question, which I'm sure you've heard before, is are nuclear power plants and hydrogen production, are these part of the solution?
Good question. I'll try to keep it as simple as I can. First of all, hydrogen, yes, but you have to make the hydrogen using renewable energies. That's called green hydrogen. So if you make hydrogen and you burn fossil fuels to make the hydrogen, then you actually it's not a viable decarbonization solution. But ultimately, yes. Why is that? Well, industry has to decarbonize also, and hydrogen is a way, along with some forms of solar, concentrated solar, of getting the high temperatures that are necessary in order to decarbonize industry, which requires high temperatures for various kinds of industrial processes. That would include cement manufacturing and steel manufacture and so forth. That's important. And also hydrogen can also provide a fuel that can be used for shipping and so forth. So yes, but as far as nuclear power goes, in the United States, starting with the United States, so nuclear power exists in different forms. So the first form is fission. That takes large nuclei and breaks them up. And that's what all of the nuclear power plants are in the world today, with different details. The other is fusion, which takes little nuclei and fuses them together. That's a completely different paradigm and is being investigated now in a more and more serious way in Europe and also in other places, including in this country. Even business is starting to talk about fusion. Fusion, let me talk about fusion first, because may not be as familiar with. Fusion does not have the problems of fission, does not have potential proliferation problems, doesn't have the same storage problems for thousands of years of the radioactive waste that fission plants do, and it can't blow up or melt down. So fusion plants, if and when we can get fusion, will not have the problems of fission. Fusion could be used, for example, in a base load scenario, for example, to generate water. We're running short of water, and fusion plants could with desalinization plants, power the desalinization plants, or provide a backload for scenarios, for example, that have been advanced notably by Alexander McDonald, who used to run a NOAA lab, to have a nationwide system of high voltage DC lines that carry wind from the Midwest, solar panel from the South West and from the Northeast, nationwide, in such a way with some baseload power and then hooking into the AC network that we have now, basically keeping the lights on for including growth and at a reasonable price, 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So anyway, so that's the scenario for fusion. For fission, there are various kinds of fission plants, and they're promoted in what are called advanced modular reactors. They still have the same basic problems that have never been solved of proliferation, storage of radioactive material, and possible meltdown. Although the modular reactors are safer than the others, the basic problem with all the fission reactors is that they're just too expensive. They take too long to build, and the last one of which I'm aware, which was being built in South Carolina, I believe, was abandoned. In some other countries, some nuclear plants are being built. France has what are called breeder reactors. So there is a fourth generation fission reactor, which relies on what are called fast neutrons, and they have they're much less problematic than the present light water slow neutron fission reactors that we have now, and they will also eat radioactive waste that comes out of the fission reactors from today. The basic problem is that they're just very expensive, and the time scale of making one of these things is very long. And that's a complicated answer, but it's a kind of complicated problem. There's also all kinds of political issues, and there's also a lack of understanding, which is there as well.
So there's a lot of chattering going on in the chat, and I think a lot of it is sort of people debating with each other about various things. But I'll just close with one last question. There's a question about Joe Manchin and coal, and I would add to that. I mean, he's he's got personal interests in keeping the coal industry alive, but so does China and so does India. I mean, keeping coal alive is not just happening in some parts of the United States, but they're happening in big countries like China and India that continue to be reluctant to give up coal, even though they both know that it's destroying their country's environment, much less that of the world. But how do we deal with the politics of this, particularly with some of the worst kinds of pollution like coal?
So great question to end on. So I tried to touch on this with a carbon budget and with energy equity. and with the per capita energy graphs earlier. So China and India, so if you look at India, the average per capita Indian uses 1/10 of the energy of the United States individual, okay? So from the point of view of India, you know, they have, I think it's 300 million people that don't have any energy at all, no electricity. And worldwide, there's, over 1 billion people who don't have any energy. So their argument is, well, you use fossil fuels to develop your economy, now it's our turn. And so all of them say, well, we understand there's a problem and we will ramp up our fossil fuel use, but then we'll turn it off. So we will try, so energy equity is the issue there, right? Why should we you can see that so I'm in my office, right? I have lights, I have well, it's a heat pump actually, but I'm comfortable. Why shouldn't somebody in a little Indian village have the same energy, that I have? Well, there isn't any moral reason. But if we do it with coal, then if they do it with coal, they'll blow through the carbon budget and the world will become unlivable for everybody. So basically there's a dance going on, and it's the Chinese and Indians and other underdeveloped countries too. The African continent is one example, which we haven't talked about at all, where they say, well, it's our turn to use our fair share of the remaining carbon budget, and the cheapest way for us to do it is coal, and we haven't got the money to do anything else. Although it is true that India and China have huge renewable energy projects. China is actually far and away, I think, in terms of renewable energy projects, the leader internationally. So it is the central question. That's what I tried to illustrate when I was talking about how do we make a negotiated agreement that's fair and at the same time keeps the planet livable. It's not easy, and it's understanding. I think it's really important to understand others' points of view, and that is their point of view. For Joe Manchin, so Joe Manchin has single-handedly reduced the amount of money available for the Inflation Reduction Act. He owns coal mines, and the Republican alternatives to Joe Manchin are far worse. I might also point out that the Republican Party is I would say, having been a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby and for many years gone to the Hill and talked with Republican staffers, so I know that there are some Republicans that don't really, follow the party line, but the party line is actually against renewable energies and for fossil fuels. And so with unanimity, they oppose, things like the Inflation Reduction Act. In fact, right now they're trying to kill it. And in Texas, for example, where wind and the whole Midwest, where wind energy is now is a rising fraction of the energy production, state legislators in Texas are trying to come out against it. So these are real problems. We talked about business, starting to wake up. Well, it's also true that 70% of the business CEOs are Republicans, white male Republicans. So it's a real problem. And so what we need to go forward again is courage, optimism, persistence, and just to take it back to the very beginning, Unitarian Universalists and you can play a huge role, and I urge you to do it.
Thank you so much. This has been really a wonderful talk, and I think you've inspired all of us. You really should. We'll have to send you the chat because there's a lot in there. Even we have some Canadians here, and they're also dealing with their own issues. And they, I think, are beginning to see and are placing climate above other issues. And there are lots of really important issues, anti-racism and all these other things. But if we don't get the climate right, then none of these other things are even possible. And you've really made that very clear to all of us. So thank you very much. This is being recorded. I'm hoping that we will send this around and that many people will watch it. And I hope that we can maybe bring you back at some point. I'm sure there'll be more questions, but really thank you for your time and for your many, many years of dedication to this very important topic.
Well, I appreciate that, Bruce. And you've also been very influential and have helped me. And so it's fine with me if you distribute this video. And it's also fine with me if you distribute the PDF file that I sent to some of you at least. And I'm happy to come back. Happy to come back.